When did book talk become political? Because I am so sick of seeing these reader unfollow parties.
I am
where you guys
mortified and
share
disgusted
books
with the book talk community.
Hello and welcome back to my channel. My intention was to sit down and talk about the books that I've been reading this fall, but something very major happened in the United States. Recently, there was a presidential election. So I'm not a political commentator, but I do like books. So because of those factors, there are some within online book communities who would say, good, don't talk about politics then. Unfortunately, to discuss books is to discuss politics. Regardless of how much you do not want to talk about politics, if you want to put blinders on, plug your ears up, to discuss books, to read books, you are inherently involving yourself in politics. This recent presidential election has created division on book talk. Some book talkers and authors after the election asked for those who voted conservative to unfollow them. And it was called like a book talk unfollow party. This book talk unfollow party is what I'm assuming prompted Kenzie's Book Nook to post a video where she was asking book talk and really essentially all of the book, like the online book community, to keep politics out of the space.
So I'm not sure when book talk became politic talk. We are here to talk about books, talk about what we like for books, etc.
People criticize book talk for a number of things: for promoting bad books, for promoting toxic relationships, for being problematic, for promoting problematic authors, for being anti-intellectual. On the contrary, though, there also has been a lot of positives. So with that negativity, there's been an increase in book sales. There's been an increase in generally like the amount of readers. According to Publishers Association, more people are turning to books over streaming to escape this summer, and this was published in 2023. A new polling released today by the Publishers Association has found that people are turning to books and reading as a form of escapism this summer. Second only to watching TV, 54% are watching TV. 33% of respondents say that books offer them the best form of escapism when they are having a bad day. This is ahead of streaming TV, 32%, looking at social media, 27%, listening to radio, 24%, going to the pub. This is also a British, I'm assuming, association. So 21%, going to the cinema, 16%, and listening to a podcast, 14%. The polling was released as the Publishers Association launches its second annual Insights dashboard following the Year in Publishing summary that was launched in April. This once again showed growth for the sector, with total sales for the UK's publishing industry reaching £6.9 billion, up 4% from 2021. 669 million physical books were also sold last year. This is the highest overall level ever recorded. The export market has played a huge role in the industry's success in 2022, with an 8% increase, which takes its toll to £4.1 billion. So that's just one source, and that is from the UK. So I have a ton of other articles talking about just like the popularity, the rise in reading because of book talk. So this website, this is from gohenry.com. It's also British. This says, why Gen Z are the new bookworms. This was 2024. February 2024. So March is World Book Day, and whether your child is happy to dress up as their favorite book character or too cool to care, there's another way to make your kids read. #BookTok is the powerful book-loving community on TikTok that's boosting Gen Z's zeal for reading and turning them into bookworms. Gen Z leads the new reading curve. As a result, UK readers aged 14 to 25 have become the most prominent consumers of fiction. According to Nielsen Book Data, Gen Z buys an estimated 61 million books and spends £469 million, representing 18% of the overall book market. The largest portion of their purchases stems from child/young adult fiction. Author Justin Somper of Pirate Academy, whose Vampirates books have sold over 1 million worldwide, says At a time when we're often told young people are reading less and that attention spans have plummeted, it's a pleasant irony that it's a social media platform that is actually bringing young people back to books in such a powerful way. You only have to take a quick dip into hashtag booktok to see the knowledge and energy they bring to their reading choices with peer-to-peer recommendations. Despite there being an uptick in reading, it doesn't mean there's been a positive growth in reading comprehension, and unfortunately, data, at least from my country, the United States, corroborates the fact that reading comprehension is decreasing. So according to the National Center for Education, performance in basic reading and math skills amongst students of all races is trending downward. Part of this does have to do with the pandemic, taking kids out of school in an environment that they're very used to and putting them into, these online virtual classrooms wasn't helpful for a lot of people. Not everyone's good with online school. The Annie E. Casey Foundation claims the abrupt shift to remote learning and changing how students interact with their teachers dramatically affected them. But you can blame the pandemic for a lot of things. The pandemic really made majority of things worse for not just this country, but around the world. Everybody's suffered because of the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, reading comprehension has been on the decline, with the average performance of the United States 4th and 8th graders. That's a very specific group, but the average performance of the United States 4th and 8th graders, they are declining in math and reading from it. This has been shown from 2017 to 2019. There was a decline between those years. Before the pandemic, 8th graders' reading comprehension declined substantially. Since then, scholars have been trying to figure out why their scores dropped so much between 2017 and 2019 on a highly regarded national test known as the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. Researchers at the American Institutes for Research, a non-profit research organization, are digging into whether kids are reading less, perhaps distracted by their digital devices. The emerging answer is that yes, young teens seem to be reading less and enjoying reading less, but the decline in book reading might not be the main culprit in our national comprehension problem, and separate international studies of 15-year-olds and 4th graders indicate that 8th grade reading habits aren't telling the whole story. So what is interesting about this article is that it says there has been a decline in reading, in book reading, but this article came out in 2021. It looks like they were focusing on certain years, so 2017 to 2019. And I mean, TikTok has existed before the pandemic, but the pandemic made TikTok blow up. And that's around the time that people did start reading more. So I think that's interesting that if this is going based off of 2017 to 2019, I think it is interesting that they were showing or seeing statistically kids were reading less. But now it seems like since 2020, they've been reading more. I am not a data person. I'm not a data scientist. This is just what I'm assuming. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I'm assuming. That's my assumption. First, the numbers. In survey questions that accompany the NAEP test, 8th graders reported how much time they spent reading outside of school. The percentage of public school students who said they read 30 minutes or more a day besides homework declined by 4 percentage points from 53% in 2017 to 49% in 2019. These same young teens were also less likely to say they talked about books or went to the library. Positive attitudes about reading fell too. 8th grade students were less likely to agree that reading was one of their favorite activities or that they enjoyed going to a bookstore. At first, the declines in reading habits and attitudes seemed to fit together with a decline in reading scores and tell a simple story. Those who read more scored higher, but when the researchers broke the data down by state, the neat correlation between reading and comprehension fell apart. There were some states, such as Mississippi, where students read less, but scores didn't drop. And in other states, such as Rhode Island, reading habits were more stable, but scores slid nonetheless. It's perplexing, said Alina Forzani, an assistant professor of education at Boston University, in reaction to this reading data, which is still unpublished but was presented at 2 education conferences in April 2021. We know that reading motivation causes kids to pick up books and read more, and more you read, the better you get at it. Forzani, a reading specialist who was not involved in this analysis, wonders if current survey questions are out of step with our digital age and fail to capture all the new kinds of reading that young teens are doing every day. Perhaps reading posts on social media and clicking on article links in Google searches are useful types of reading too. Students might be learning new words and information and thinking critically about texts. boosting their comprehension skills in the same way that old-fashioned book reading does. If a kid just wants to sit and watch videos all the time, I wouldn't want my kids doing that either, Forzani said. It's a passive activity, but if they're creating their own videos, that's much more active and requires complex and critical cognitive processes, and I think that's what matters more. Forzani said reading is hugely important. Her advice to parents is to allow kids to read whatever they want to. It's always been the case that we want to let kids read whatever motivates them, Forzani said, because if they're not motivated to read, nothing else is going to work. Forzani thinks the slide in 8th grade test scores could be the result of the way that schools teach reading to struggling students. We tend to take those kids and throw lower level instruction at them. She said they get these rote phonics programs. It's all focused on learning to read. They're not having complex discussions about a text. At the same time, we're also taking away science and history instruction where kids can develop knowledge and where they can put comprehension strategies into practice. We're teaching kids to read in a content and motivational vacuum. Forzani's theory for why reading comprehension is deteriorating is compelling, especially since the steepest falls were among low-achieving students, but it still needs to be backed up by research. The striking decline in students' reading habits may be a relatively recent phenomenon in the United States. International data from prior years doesn't reveal that American students are less enthusiastic about reading. Martin Hooper, a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research, who led the 8th grade reading study, has also been digging into reading habits around the world, and he's found an even earlier decrease in reading and reading attitudes in other countries. Between 2000 and 2018, fewer 15-year-olds reported reading for enjoyment in 31 out of 39 countries. In jurisdictions surveyed by the Program in International Student Assessment, PISA, which also released its own report on reading habits in the digital age on May 4th, 2021. The US was one of the few exceptions, bucking the disappointing trend here. American 4th graders also didn't show the same antipathy toward reading that their international counterparts did in surveys by the Progress in International Reading Literacy Studies. Elsewhere around the world, 4th graders had more negative attitudes about reading in 2016 than 4th graders did in 2001 in 13 out of 20 countries and jurisdictions. In the survey of elementary school children, parents had even more negative attitudes toward reading than their children. Parents reported reading less for enjoyment in 15 out of 18 countries and jurisdictions. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, said Hooper. We're all struggling. I think there's a lot of factors too regarding some of the data that was found among parents. I mean, a lot of people are working a lot, and especially with things getting more expensive, some people have 2-3 jobs. People are tired. People don't always have the time to read. I love reading, but like for example, I tell myself when I go to bed, that'll be my time to read. But once I get in bed, I'm out. And it's not like I don't have days off from working. It's just, when I do have my day off, like sometimes I don't want to sit and read. Sometimes I can't sit and read because I still have stuff to do. But I think a lot of the things that were presented in this article are interesting. Obviously, again, it looks like they were looking kind of pre-pandemic at some of the statistics, and from a lot of the statistics showing a positive growth in reading, it was post-pandemic or a result of being in lockdown and people not really having much to do, so they started picking up books. There's only so much doom scrolling, so much TV, so much YouTube videos that you can watch, and so you want to do something else. But I think kind of what also was interesting is that there were some parts through the article that if you read more, you become a better reader. But also you can read as much as you want, but if you're not engaging in a text and actually learning how to interpret texts, then it's not like it's not doing anything. I mean, reading is first and foremost, well, not first and foremost, but oftentimes it really is. It's entertainment. It's supposed to be enjoyable. Reading is not supposed to be torture. You're supposed to enjoy it. You can go to school and learn to read and become a decent reader, but if you're not actually learning to interpret the text, especially if you're reading a book where the author is trying to tell you something and you're not getting that at all because you just want to read the book and you're not really trying to actively participate in the book, then there's just something missing. As far as reading though, and reading scores, especially in the United States, unfortunately, I mean, I don't see education improving. The best way to continue exploiting a population is to maintain ignorance. That is why oppressive regimes often target books and education, because especially with books, you're reading from different perspectives, different lives. You can read from the perspective of somebody who is experiencing prejudice, and to read from somebody who might have a different life than you and to actually empathize with them, that is a threat to a government or to people who want to remain in power, to who, want you to think and act the same. That's why, again, simply just reading like a whole bunch of books, and people can read like 100, 200, 300 books in a year. A lot of people just have that time. Just reading that many books or reading a lot or just consuming, it doesn't make you necessarily smart. Being able to comprehend the words on page is what's most important, and it's something that I do feel like what that article that I just read pointed out. I don't think that that's something that's being taught well in school, and I think it's because of the way the curriculum is set up in American schools, at least from my experience. I didn't really learn how to properly interpret text until I took AP literature. The American education system not really being able to teach kids how to comprehend what they're reading properly. I do think a lot of that has to do with just a lot of failures in the way that the government is failing our education system. A lot of it is hard to control as well. There's a population thing where I live. People are moving here. Oh my God, it's too many people here. I feel like I'm suffocating. With the amount of people moving here, they're always building new high schools, new elementary schools, middle schools, but there's still so many people. There's still so many people. There's too many kids in one classroom for one teacher to handle, and some of those kids are bad. Okay, some of them kids are really bad. That has to also do with funding. If a school can't hire enough teachers, if a school can't be built big enough. When I was in school, the FCAT, which is the Florida Comprehensive Assessment Test, it was the standardized test that all Florida students had to take in the spring. It started in 1998 and it went up to 2015 until it stopped. So there were criticisms about the FCAT, and for a good reason. The entire school year was basically preparing to take the test and to pass the test, because passing the test pretty much would get you passing to the next grade. If you failed the FCAT, honestly, I don't really remember. My reading scores and writing scores were good. My math, I don't even know half the time how I passed any of my math classes by the skin of my teeth, but basically it felt like we were just learning to pass a test, and a test that has very specific things on it, and basically memorization, things like that. We weren't actually learning for the sake of acquiring knowledge and to be productive members of society. The American education system, from my little corner in Florida, which is really not that little, my experience especially in the southern United States, because the South has notoriously the worst education in the country. Southern states are at the bottom for education. But as a whole, the American education system is not doing great and has been struggling for a while. I've not been in school since this whole war on education has begun. I'm glad that I left school before it started, because it's so weird to have schools, and in particular public education, become these cultural battlegrounds. When I went to school, nobody was people were not forcing anything down my throat. A lot of my teachers were really good at being apolitical, and even my government teacher, he was not specific at all. Literally just taught us the facts of history, was a really great government teacher. I don't see how that would have changed so quickly within not even a decade, that teachers suddenly are imposing certain ideals. I can see teachers becoming more inclusive, especially if they truly care about children and want to make all children feel comfortable in their classroom. But making schools these cultural battlegrounds, it's not helping to improve our education, because we're focusing on We're focusing on those things instead of actually improving education. So from the National Education Association, NEA, today, manufactured outrages designed to divide educators and parents for political gain didn't work in 2022, a recent NEA survey found. Instead, midterm voters were focused on school safety, the educator shortage, book bans, and other challenges. Unfortunately, as the 2024 campaign season begins to take shape, the culture war on public schools doesn't show many signs of abating. According to John Rogers, who is a professor at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA and director of UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, he believes that we are at an existential moment for public education and a diverse democracy. Since 2017, Rogers and his colleagues have been tracking how the increasingly divisive and polarizing political climate has sown discord in communities, targeted inclusive curricula, and aimed to undermine overall confidence in public education. In Rogers and his colleagues' latest report, Educating for a Diverse Democracy, the Chilling Role of Political Conflict in Blue, Purple, and Red Communities, finds that in the midst of political conflicts, students have limited opportunities to engage in learning and respectful dialogue on controversial topics, and it's become harder to address rampant misinformation. The highly charged environment has also led to marked declines in support for teaching about race, racism, and racial and ethnic diversity. And then, unfortunately, of course, there has been harassment of LGBTQ youth. There was actually a non-binary child, Nex Benedict. They were a 16-year-old student at Oklahoma High School. They tragically died after being beaten unconscious in a school bathroom. A lot of kids take cues from their parents, and parents are not necessarily good people. The nasty stuff that you say around your kids, they will pick it up. I've heard a lot of people say a lot of things. I think that I've learned to be empathetic because, I don't know, my mom being a reader, she did read a lot of books from people of different cultures, even if that's why reading is so important, even if you don't have the opportunity, like if you live in a small town in America or in another place and you don't have much opportunity to interact with people of different races or backgrounds, reading can help that. You are in like some small town in Nebraska and have never met like a Black person, an Indian person, like if you've not met it like a Jewish person or a Muslim or a Buddhist or somebody who's experienced being displaced from their home because of a war, like if you've not met people like that and most of your circle is people like you, if you read a book that has somebody who has a completely different experience from you, you can learn from the book and learn to understand some like the difficulties of other people's lives that are not like yours. And again, that is the danger that people see in books. That's why books are targeted, because you can learn a lot just by reading, and you can travel just by reading. My mom being so well-read and sensitive to other cultures and other people, I learned that, like I took that from her. And a lot of the time she says that some of that is she's not responsible for. I just kind of came out who I am as a person. Like I've just always been this way, but also no, maybe so. There's the whole nature versus nurture conversation. But the point is, I do think that, my mom obviously had a lot to do with who I am as a person. But anyway, so continuing to read this article, in his research, Rogers surveyed public school principals and found almost half, 45% of principals said the amount of community level conflict centered largely around opposition to inclusive curricula during the 2021 to 2022 school year was more or much more than prior to the pandemic. Only 3% said it was less. Rogers recently spoke with NEA Today about how polarization and coordinated attacks are preventing many educators from teaching controversial issues or about our nation's full history. These attacks are undermining the role public schools play in educating for our democracy. Education is targeted because an educated society is the most threatening to a government and a regime that wants to have power. That's why there was an entire book about book bans and censorship. That book gets banned in is often challenged. But absolutely, if you don't want to talk about political views, personal philosophies, beliefs, we can certainly just talk about books. The Hunger Games. It is about the aftermath of a nuclear war where America is no longer divided into states with their own freedoms, but instead districts that are being kept in order by the oppressive government in the capital, and Katniss actively fights against it. That love triangle though. So I saw a post on Threads. Every reader can absolutely take whatever they want from a book. I'm not always going into a book with the intention of being educated. The thing is, if a book is being written in earnest, then the author is trying to tell you something. I was not a fan of Fourth Wing, and the politics could have been done better. A lot could have been done better, but I did see what the author was trying to do. That was very clear and very obvious. Yaros is trying to make a point about blindly following propaganda and things that you have been taught and told from, a young age, growing up in an oppressive regime, which they don't actually necessarily know that they're living in an oppressive regime. That they're dedicated to their country of Navarre or whatever the fuck it is. I don't even know. Like, I don't remember. They have been taught to believe certain things that is not necessarily true. Like, they've been being lied to. Their government is corrupt. And it's a lot of unlearning what has been programmed into you, is what the first book is touching on. The second book goes into how history, if you're not teaching it properly, and if you're censoring things, taking things out of history, obviously you're doing your population and your citizens a disservice. But to just be like, oh, look, squirrel, as an romance, like, I'm not buying the books. But if you're gonna buy the books and read their stuff, why are you not like engaging genuinely and in earnest? Really try to pay attention to what the author is trying to tell you. It's like having a really good burger. Fourth Wing is like a McDonald's burger. McDonald's is sometimes good. It's not good for you, but if you just like shove that down, like, did you taste it? Like, you just ate it? Like, you didn't taste anything, you just ate the whole thing in like a couple bites and didn't really like appreciate the taste. So what was the point of eating it? And it's just gonna go right through you as quickly as you ate it. It's just gonna go right through you, in one ear, in through your eyes when reading a book, or in the ear, depending on how you're consuming the book, and it just went right out. Like, what was the point of spending any time at all with the book? I do think that interpretation of texts is not focused on as much in American English classrooms. Like, you just kind of answer questions and you point out very specific things, like, what are the symbols? What are the themes? But AP literature was where, like, my brain really was like, the wheels were turning. Interpretation of a text is something that you can teach. I like trying to figure out what the author meant. And the thing is that I love about literature is that you can have whatever interpretation of a book, and this also applies to movies and TV, whatever. If something's telling a story, you can have whatever interpretation you want. You just have to have evidence. But if somebody says one thing about a book, but you don't get how they got that, you interpreted it differently, you're not wrong, and you're not dumb. If you are able to give evidence, then that's good enough. That's why we have like book discussions and people who write papers and scholarly articles on interpreting like one book. So I was one of those kids that read above their grade level in school, but that's just because I was really good at figuring out like how to pronounce words and stuff like that. I started reading at a young age, but just because I could read the big words, just because I could pronounce them, it doesn't mean that I was really comprehending what I was reading. Like, I was an elementary school kid able to read college level literature, but I did not have a college age experience. So like, I was like 8 years old and my biggest concern was what I would be buying at the Scholastic Book Fair. It's not even just like kids can't understand the higher level things, it's just you have to teach it. I was just reading stuff without really being taught how to interpret it, is kind of basically where I'm getting at. Reading comprehension is the ability to read text, process it, and understand its meaning. It relies on two interconnected abilities: word reading, being able to decode the symbols on the page, and language comprehension, being able to understand the meaning of the words and sentences. When we make sense of a text, however, we don't just remember the exact words and phrases we read. Rather, we form a mental model of what the text describes by integrating the sense of the words and sentences into a meaningful whole, like a film that plays in our head. Good comprehension is vital if reading is to have a purpose. If a reader is to engage with and learn from a text, and ultimately, if a reader is to enjoy what they're reading. Even if you're reading a romance book for escapism, if a character mentions like using contraception, that is a personal belief, a philosophy, an ideology, and inherently is political, because not everyone believes, not all belief systems believe in contraception. Deep reading, as it's called, deep reading, reading comprehension, interpretation, literary analysis, whatever you want to call it, it is not something that just a scholar does, or an English literature student does, or somebody in high school writing an essay. It's just something that a reader does. Writers have always published their articles, their books, their poems in response to something. So it might be the political climate that they're existing in, it might be a certain event that happened during their life when they were a child, when they're an adult, when they're an adolescent, and that event could be something on a grander scale or something in their own personal life. Maybe they're affected by tragedy. So dark romance and smut are then responses. The protagonists of these usually are women. There are male protagonists, so there's like dual POV, but I'm speaking primarily from the female perspective, the female character. The smut books and the romance books and the dark romance and the fantasy romance, they focus so much on female sexuality. Reading these books where they're sex positive, and then also in these romance books, sometimes there's homosexual relationships, there's BDSM, there are multiple partners, like threesomes. That sex positive attitude is a progressive ideology. On the opposite end, there are books with conservative ideology that have been popular. So Twilight is a prime example. From what I understand, Stephenie Meyer is a Mormon, or was a practicing Mormon. I don't know. I'm assuming she still is one. Number one, the large piece of evidence is that Edward and Bella decide to wait to have sex after they get married. But once they are married, Bella gets pregnant immediately. Then, even though her life is in danger while pregnant with her abomination, Bella decides to keep the pregnancy. So, which is a choice that is oddly, it goes both sides, because it's at the same time, like, Bella is willing to give up her life for this pregnancy, but at the same time, it's still her choice. Like, it's a choice. It leans more into conservative ideology, but because it is her choice, it's her choice. I know the books came out way before I was in middle school, but the movies is what made me aware of the books, and the movies were coming out when I was in middle school. I wasn't quite aware of that those politics. Now that I do know, and now that I've developed the ability to like analyze, I've not read the books, I've watched the movies, but they're coming from Stephenie Meyer's ideas. Now I do recognize the politics of Twilight, and they're not mine, but I know what the author was doing, and I recognize that, and I'm aware of what I'm consuming. So I don't have blinders on, just so that I can enjoy the movies, which I do. I have enjoyed the movies, like, I can't lie, like, I've watched them. So the idea that politics don't belong in a space of readers and in places where books are being discussed is so strange to me. I don't think I ever even realized that people thought that was something that you could do. Like, it's just very weird to me. It seems like it doesn't make any sense. Like, reading is political. It's in who you read, it's in how you read, it's in the fact that you know how to read, especially if you're a woman, and it's in the fact that you have the ability to sit down in a quiet space and read and not be bothered. So the act of reading, specifically sitting down with your own personal book, is a fairly new thing as far as human history goes. Like, storytelling predates reading. While reading has not always been a thing, writing has also not always been a thing. The reason why we've termed caveman times, like quote unquote caveman times, I know there's all different types of human species. I know. I'm not a historian, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a biologist. I've looked it up out of curiosity. There's a lot of different human species. I'm just going to say caveman times. So the reason why that time period is prehistory is because that period of humanity was not recorded, and it existed before written record. Because of archaeology and what was left behind by these prehistorical groups, we can infer that they had a culture. They left behind, cave paintings, weapons, jewelry. So they clearly had a culture. They probably had a language. I guess they looked at the neck structure or something of a caveman skeleton and determined that they had the ability to not just speak, but it wasn't necessarily the grunts and stuff. It was they might have had a complex language system like we have right now today. There are civilizations that left many records that we can figure out a lot about how they lived, the things that they wore, the things that they believed, who their kings were, who were their nobles, and things like that because of all the detail that they left. So writing is recognized as having been invented in Mesopotamia and Egypt in the 4th millennium BCE, in China in the 2nd millennium BCE, and in Mesoamerica in the 1st millennium BCE. So I only have knowledge about Mesopotamia because I took one class on it, and I'm definitely not an expert, but I'm the most familiar with that society. But basically, from Mesopotamia, they had these clay tablets that they recorded on. They used it to make receipts of things, like receipts from buying sheep. They recorded disbursement of wages for employees. And they also wrote down recipes. There's small things like that give us insight into how they lived their daily lives. The earliest surviving literature is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written in the late 2nd millennium. It is an ancient Mesopotamian epic poem about Gilgamesh, a possible real-life king of the Sumerian city-state of Uruk. So there's a really good crash course video that summarizes the poem, but essentially Gilgamesh is trying to chase immortality, but by the end of the story, he ultimately learns to be okay with being a mortal human. By reading a story like this, we can kind of get an idea of some of the values of people who lived during that time. So society influences the stories that are written. There's a reason we have the saying, truth is stranger than fiction. Writers write what they know, making it not a coincidence that certain eras of our history have produced similar stories. So we have the Transcendentalist movement that was a reaction to industrialization. And then during the antebellum period in America, there was literature glorifying plantation life. But at the same time, there was literature from the abolitionist side from both Black and white authors counteracting the pleasant image that was being presented in some of the more polished images of what a plantation is like. World War I created a lot of disillusionment around the world. It was the first World War. So people were just a little bit more depressed. And that's how you get, what's it called? The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, which is very much just about a man who is very depressed. The Great Gatsby was a response to the absurd materialism in the 1920s. All forms of art, including literature, are responses to what is happening around us. So that could be politics, the social movements, even pop culture. All of that, it influences us. You can't escape it, and these things just influence writers. Even if somebody writes in a fantasy world, you're being influenced by another existing culture. The culture happened before stories. So our culture, it has influenced the stories that we write. Male readers do obviously exist, but BookTok and the online book community has been overwhelmingly female, and all the creators that I saw who were complaining about BookTok becoming political were women. Throughout human history, women have been allowed and forbidden to read. There are societies that were sort of progressive that gave women significant freedoms, and then there were societies like those of ancient Greece and Rome where only the elite, which was typically men, were allowed to be educated. And even then you had outliers who, because of their status, whether they were a man or a woman, were well educated. But there, of course, were several societies where women were banned from reading entirely. And so I point out the obvious that being able to read is a political act as a woman. But even today, in 2024, going on 2025, there are societies that are actively oppressing women for simply being women. There are societies that don't let women go to school. There are some societies that don't even allow women to have a voice. So the fact that we can read, and that we can read whatever we want, we can read fantasy, we can read romance with the dirtiest, nasty smut. There's books that protest the government. There's books that talk about other religions. books about atheism, books with queer people in it. Like, that alone is a political act and a protest of so many past and present regimes. In this article called Women in Reading by Kate Flint, it was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2006. Flint says reading is an intensely private inward experience on the one hand, and on the other as inseparable from a social world. Whether in terms of what reading represents or because of the debates reading has the power to provoke, or the sense of connection or of separation that a shared acquaintance with particular books can foster. So what this article by Flint made me think, even if you absolutely do not want to be political, like if you just throw your hands up and you're just like, I really just want to read and not be involved in politics, if you talk about a book, you're engaging in dialogue that may become political, even if you don't realize it. So let's take the least political book that I can think of, which is People We Meet on Vacation. It's about two best friends who travel together, and spoiler alert, by the way, spoiler if you want to read it, eventually the two best friends do fall in love. Them falling in love, it makes things complicated, partly not just because they're friends, but because they kind of want different things. But at the end, the female character, she decides that she doesn't necessarily have to have everything all planned out. She doesn't know if she wants kids. She doesn't know if she wants to move to a different state for her relationship. But she and her partner decide that they will just date and be together and decide on things as it comes along and just basically be grown-ups and talk about it. For a woman to make that decision for herself without her partner or family or a government commanding her to follow her male partner, if you just talk about that, like, you don't have to necessarily talk about politics, but if you point out that fact, that is political. But I feel like I've kind of made my point. Books are political, especially when we're talking about women who are reading. The conversation was started by a woman on TikTok, and I've seen primarily women on TikTok complaining about politics in BookTok. I'm sure that there's men talking about it, I don't know, but what I've seen is a lot of women talking about it. Reading is fun. And I don't think that you have to read books like War and Peace all the time to be a reader. You can read your fairy smut, you can read your monster smut, because I will too. But I do beg people to kind of use some critical thinking and also just pay attention. Without paying attention to what's happening in the world around you, your freedom to read as much sex as you want, and monsters banging women, and aliens banging women, and fairies banging women or men, whatever floats your boat, could be taken away. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, I hope you have a good rest of your day, or read a book and write an essay.